Good to see you all coming in and welcome everyone and thanks for being here. And if you're watching the recording, thank you for watching the recording. Hi from Australia. Welcome, Elizabeth. Right, so what I'm going to do tonight is this. So let me put the thing up, and it is the secret to perfect rolled edge on the serger. And it is a stitch that gives people a lot of trouble. And I understand that. Um, So what I want to do is I am going to show you a bit of a slideshow because it kind of helps to show you what the problems are. And then I'm going to suggest some ways to perfect it. And then I'm going to give you the ultimate way to, well, the two ultimate ways to perfect it. So it's progressive. So let us go on to the next slide. And I talk about rolled hem. And hem, rolled edge, same thing, turns under a small hem and it stitches on the edge. And the problem that most people encounter is it has gaps in the stitching and little bits of fiber can poke through from the fabric called pokies. And it is very annoying. And actually, it can also give you an uneven stitch. So you have gaps in it, and it's a stitch I use to finish the edge of ruffles, linen napkins, all sorts of things. And when it looks nice, it looks super nice. But when it doesn't, it looks horrid. So how can we make it perfect? Let's go on. So a lot of people say, why not use woolly nylon? And the advantage of woolly nylon is it is fibrous, so it has lots of threads in it to cover the edge. And woolly nylon is the trade name for YLI, okay? But there's lots of similar threads. So that would be your stretch maxi lock, your soft lock by Wonderfill. And I do want to add that a lot of these come in different thicknesses. So if it's thicker, it's going to help you more, okay? So somebody says their screen's frozen. It shouldn't be. I don't think so. I am on a slideshow, so it is moving through that. So let's have a look at the problems. And that's really why I wanted to use the slideshow for this, because you can see it more easily. So there are several things that can happen. So I've given my settings on this, and I'm going to put this up in the file section of Deb Canham Serger Sanity projects. So if you want to download the information, you can. But let us look at side A. That's the left side of this square. And I have, if you look at it, you can see it's really puckered. Okay, the stitch has caused the fabric to pucker. And that quite often happens with this stitch because it's a lot of stitch feeding along, and it will sometimes do that. Of course, it's dependent on your fabric, but in this case, I used a regular cotton, and you can see it very definitely puckers. So, what is the answer to that? The answer to that is to move your differential feed down to 0.08 or 0.06. That will stretch the fabric out and it will prevent the puckers. So, that's a big step forward. We can get rid of the puckers by getting rid or by engaging the differential feed so that it's stretching out the fabric as it feeds under the foot. So that was the first problem, the puckering. Okay, so I'm now going to go to the next slide. And now we're going to look at the bottom ledge. Now for this one, I use the same settings, except that I use the differential feed on 0.06. And you can see that I actually do have some gaps in that section. You can see the stitches aren't quite even. And so what am I going to do now, apart from panic? I have uneven stitches. And this is using Maxi Lock Stretch. Okay. So my next step would be to use something like a Solvi stabilizer. So let's move on to the next one. Use something like a Solvi stabilizer. Keep all my settings the same. So my differential feed on 0.06. And take my Solvi stabilizer, which is kind of like a plastic tearaway. I can show it to you in a minute. and I would put that on the top of the fabric edge. And what that does is it just encourages the fabric to roll the hem more neatly, and you get a superb rolled hem stitch. I mean, it's just perfection. But I can understand that not everybody wants to cover every stitch they do using the plastic fold over, tearaway stabilizer. Um, but that would be your solution. So, what if you don't want to use that and you still want to improve the look of your stitch without using a stabilizer? Well, your next step is to use a heavier thread. And in this case, I used Wonderfill Fruity, which is a 12 weight thread. And I didn't have to use the Solvay stabilizer on the top of it. Because it's a thicker thread, it kind of solved the problem for me. So what I'm saying to you is if you're having problem with rolled hems, consider going heavier on your thread. So you can see it's pretty neat there. There's not much, there's the stitches are even and it's worked well. And again, I've still got my differential feed on 0.06. And the only difference I might have made, which I did, is I probably increased my stitch length. Okay, and that's because I was using a heavier thread. So the only adjustment I needed to make was just to make the stitch length a fraction longer. And remember, I'm using the R numbers, and I will cover that when I give you the demo. So what if you want even better coverage and even more perfection? Well, the answer to that is to use an even heavier weight thread. And on this one, I used Wonderfill Dazzle. It's an 8 weight thread. And you can see I've got perfect coverage. I haven't got uneven stitches. And I didn't have to use any Solvay plastic on the top to make my stitches even. So that basically, I think, is my slideshow. Yep. I'll just give you the summary. If you're having problems with rolled edge, consider using a plastic Solvay stabilizer on the top. If that's too much trouble, just increase the weight of your thread. If you increase the weight of your thread, you may have to increase the stitch length to accommodate it. So let me come back to me. And that basically is what tonight's about. And I'm going to sew a sample for you so you can see that. But first of all, I'm going to ask if there are any questions. What about filane thread? What weight is filane thread, Chuck? I've never heard of that thread, but an aeroflock again is just another name for the woolly nylon in a different company. Woolly nylon. We tend to say woolly nylon. That's the wire thread. But you have soft lock, you have aerolock, you have maxi lock stretch. They're all a woolly nylon. And just on that subject, majority of them are nylon. Okay. I know that the soft lock from Wonderfill is a poly. Okay, so it's not a nylon, it's a poly. One thing you do have to watch a little bit is the nylon content if you're going to use a very hot iron on the stitching, because nylon will melt. So don't forget it comes in a poly too. So yes, so you're asking me questions. So Linda says the 8 weight only in the upper looper. Yes, when we're doing a rolled edge, the only thread that shows is the upper looper thread. So you're going to put your decorative or heavier thread just in the upper looper. Aeroflock is a polyester too. Thank you. I didn't know that. So yes, the only thread that shows is the upper looper. So it's quite an economical stitch in that you only need to put decorative thread in the upper looper. So, right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my camera because it's nowhere near my machine. Let's put it on it. Might move my machine down a little today. Right, so I'm going to bring that in. And you can see I've got my machine. I just want to cover a couple things about a rolled edge. A rolled edge, you're going to use the right hand needle, and depending on what machine you have, most of the baby locks, when you look at the stitch length dial, that's the bottom dial, you'll find two sets of numbers, 1 to 4, and then 1 to 4 rolled hem, and it says rolled hem on it. And all that happens is when you move that dial to those rolled numbers, it moves the stitch finger, which needs to happen to get a rolled edge. Now, on the Benina machine, the L890, you have a switch. It's an O or a R, and you would have to move it from O to R. And that again would just remove your stitch finger. For those of you that don't have that kind of switch, you may have to manually remove it, but it will tell you in your manual as to how that works for your machine. So I have my machine set up. I'm using the right needle. I'm on the R numbers. I have my stitch width on 3.5. For the baby locks, I have my automatic stitch selector on D delta. Okay. And like I said at the beginning, a big part of the problem is the puckering when you don't use your differential feed. Now, I've got my differential feed all the way down. Okay, so it's at 0.06. And what that's doing is it's stretching the fabric out as it feeds under the foot. So my front feed dogs are working slower than the back ones. And that's going to stop the puckering. So I have my machine set up to run. Chuck says, sulky makes the filane thread. It doesn't say the weight on the spool. You know, if you have a thread that you really like that's a fine thread, you can always mix it with another fine thread and feed them both through the upper looper. I mean, that's certainly an option if you have, a thread that you really want to use for this project. So let's pretend I'm doing a napkin for a doll's house. And what I'm going to do is and this is the way I do it. It doesn't have to be the way you do it, but I'm going to lift my foot and I'm going to put my raw edge right up to the knife. And then what I want to do is I want to nail that fabric. So I'm going to turn my needle, my wheel on the right of the machine towards me just to advance the needle. And that's going to go into the fabric. And then I'm just going to stitch. And I think it's really important not to push or pull. Okay. And it seems to take a long time because it's got a very short stitch length, so you have to be patient with it. Right, so here's mine, and you can see it's nice except for when I get to the end. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that it's no longer on the stitch finger. So I'm going to address that in the next stitch. So what I'm going to do is cut this end bit off. I'm going to lift my foot, put it right up to the needle and against the knife. My knife's up, I'm using it as a guide, and I'm going to stitch again. And I did have a couple of little gaps at the end, and I think that comes from the lack of fabric on the feed dogs as it comes through. So I'm watching carefully this time, and I'm just going to lift my foot, put it down again, and stitch off. And you can see it was perfect there. Okay. So what I'm going to try and do is always sew on to an end that I've already stitched, because I think that just kind of helps, or towards a corner that I've already stitched. So going right back to the needle again. And I'm going to be careful because as it comes up to there, I can see it's going to push it. So I'm just going to lift the foot slightly, take some pressure off. Might do it once more. And what I'm looking for is perfect corners, perfect corners. And I have one more to go. This end, this is the end where I didn't get it quite perfect, but that's okay. It's going to be covered. And I didn't actually nail that edge, so I'm going to go back to manually doing it. It's just tucked a little. And I'm going to come down, lift my foot again. And you can see I've got nice corners. And people often say to me, well, what do you do with the thread chains? Well, I'm not going to be able to put those thread chains underneath the stitches on the back. So what I would do is I would douse this end in fray block or fray check. I would then go to my iron and press it until it's dry, and then I would cut it. And the reason I do that is if you press it dry rather than leave it to dry, it doesn't end up quite as hard. Okay. So do I have any questions on that? I just want to go back to, say I was using a finer fab thread and I had that problem with the stitching, then I would just take an edge of, let me cut an edge. So I've got a great big piece of this. This isn't actually Solvay, it's a heat one. It's kind of see-through plastic, and I find it works just as well. I'm not going to put it under the yarn. It will just tear away when I need it to. So here I have a strip of the Solvay. Now I'm not expecting this to be such a problem because I'm using 12 weight, but it will still look probably nicer using this. And this is an using this plastic stuff on any stitch on the edge if you're having problem is a great way to go because it will always make it look better. That's even though if I was using a narrow hem, a 3-thread, and I was having problems with it, this would be my go-to to use this tearaway Solvay type stabilizer. My Solvay strip is so long it's still stitching. So here we go. I mean, that is as perfect as you can get, but you don't always want to have to go to all that trouble. And then it just tears away. Okay. And then I cut this end, cover it again, and stitch again. So even though this 12 weight is nice at the best of times, it's still perfecting it. So I'm going to turn my hand wheel to get into to nail the fabric. If I have excess stabilizer at the top there, it's not going to matter. It's just going to tear away. So those are the two options really. If you can't get good coverage, you can use the plastic tearaway, or you can use a thicker thread, okay, or both even. But I do just want to cover something else too, and that is a lot of people using um, very fine fabrics have a problem with it tearing away. So this is a piece of paper, but it actually is the easiest way to show you what happens. So this is a very fine fabric, pretending. I actually didn't have any very fine fabric. So the problem with that is every time the needle goes into the paper, it's making a perforation. And of course, what happens when you have loads of perforations? You have a tearaway section. So how am I going to change things to work with something that's very, very fine? And I'm just going to come off because I don't really want a whole piece of paper. But you can see what's happened, and that's what I'd expect to happen. See how it's torn off? It's completely torn off the edge. So to make that less lightly, you're going to use a finer thread. I'm using the 12 weight, which would not be ideal, but you'd use a much finer thread. And the secret is to keep it on the rolled numbers, but to increase the stitch length. That means you won't get as many holes in the edge and it won't tear off. The other thing to do is to consider using the Solvay again on top. But the big secret, fine fabric, is a fine needle, fine thread, and a longer stitch length. So almost to a picot edge sometimes. If that's going to give you an edge that isn't going to pull away, then that's really what you need to look for. So would you start from the corner you've done on the other side, on the other one? What is the clear plastic called? Somebody else might know. This is it. It's just this is what you put on embroidery projects. It Solvay does it, but lots of other companies do it too. It just looks like a piece of plastic, and this one you can it tears. Well, they all do after they're stitched. But if anybody can think of a good name for it, but it's see-through, it's plasticky, and it's fine, and it tears away. Would you start from the corner you've done on the other one? I don't really I don't really worry too much which corner I start from, just as long as I get the edge right up to the needles and turn my hand wheel so that I've nailed it. Otherwise, it just keeps running away from you. It's a topper. That's exactly what it is, Karen. Karen says it's a topper. Solvay wash away stabilizer. Somebody uses it for buttonholes. What a great idea. I've never thought to do that. And I can absolutely understand why it would be so good for the same reason. It stops the pokies. Heat and gone is another type. Yeah, this is the heat one, but I just tear it away. And another time I use that is on blanket stitch when I have to pull my stitch over. I use the same thing. Badge Master by OESD. Solvay is also washable soluble. Yes, it can be. And I don't wash it away. It tears off. So yes, I think that gives you some solutions on getting a perfect rolled hem. I'm going to put you back on the machine and just in case it's clearer here than in the picture. So let's, oops, going to move you back again. So here's the picture of it. You can see it's absolute perfection on these two sides because I used the topper, okay? And you can see that it's not down these sides. That's one where I used where I didn't use the topper basically. And this was using the Maxi Lock stretch, which is quite a fine woolly nylon. There are heavier woolly nylons. So Lisa came out with a really good comment. She said, I thought you had to trim some fabric for rolled hem. Doesn't look like you are. Is that not necessary? If you, I'm going to take the picture down. If you are new to serging and you have real trouble keeping that fabric against the knife, then I recommend you do cut some. The reason I didn't was the only way I can get the fabric right up to the needle to nail it at the very beginning is by not cutting it, okay? Because it's got to go beyond the knife. So that's why I don't. But I do understand that some people um, need practice at doing that. So if you find it difficult, you're going to have to cut. The trouble with cutting is it can sometimes knock your 90-degree corner out. Okay. Could you use a rolled hem on a vinyl? Dottie, I've never done it, but I think you're under this. I mean, by all means, try it. But that would definitely be something where I'd consider increasing the stitch length so that I didn't end up with loads of tiny perforations that would tear off the edge of the vinyl. If you, as I say, if you feel you need to trim, then I think if you knew it helps to. But honestly, a lot of the time I don't cut. I just use my knife as a guide, and the only reason for it is for me the best feed is where I can get the first stitch into the fabric. So I don't want to give up that great feed. It's got all the feed dogs working for it. I always say it's the basic 101 on serging that if you I mean, I could cut a notch. That was something else you could do just for that first part. Let me just show you that if I can find a piece of fabric, because that might be a solution for somebody that feels, more that they don't like the idea of trimming. So I have, it's a narrow stitch. So let me put my camera on that. So here I've cut a notch out here. And what that's going to allow me to do is to get right back to the needle, okay? Otherwise, if I hadn't cut that notch, I would only be able to go as far as the knife. But by cutting a notch out, it allows me to come along and then cut the fabric, okay? Okay, that wasn't perfect. It might have been I pulled on it or something. But if I was going to cut, you see how I can only go back that far, and then that gives me the problem. I'll show you why it's a problem. Except my tail's got caught in the thing. I don't think it'll be a problem. See, I'm going to have trouble when this starts to feed. The fabric's going to continue to want to get away from me. Do you see how I had a little bit of problem? You can see that corner got away from me. If I had been able to nail it as I did with that one, see how nice and 90-degree that corner is compared to that corner. So that's my reason for having it against the knife. So somebody said, is that the same for doing a lettuce hem edge? On a lettuce hem, you want it to stretch. So I wouldn't worry about it stretching. I wouldn't do it on 0.06 on the differential feed. I'd stitch it round and then I'd just pull it in little sections. And I will cover that because I haven't done it for a while. But yes, lettuce edge, it stretches so you get that frilly edge at the bottom. Do you always have to use the woolly nylon in both the loopers? Is it okay to try it in the top looper? No, for rolled edge, you don't want to use the woolly nylon in both. You only need to use it in the upper looper because the thread comes round from the front, wraps all the way around to the back. So it's the only thread you see. So you only need to have the thread that's going to show in the upper looper. So if I was using woolly nylon, which I did here, to see it's pink in the front and oops, I dropped it. It's pink in the front and it's pink in the back because the thread wraps all the way around. And that's really just what I was saying that, somebody says better coverage of woolly nylon. Yeah, you do get better coverage with woolly nylon and the equivalent makes, and sometimes they're thicker, so you get even better coverage. But if you still haven't got enough coverage, then look to going for heavier thread for 12 weight and 8 weight. 8 weight thread, you'll absolutely cover the edge. Although wouldn't be a perfect thread to use on a very lightweight fabric because it's just too thick for it. Does 12 weight come in cones? It certainly does. I actually quite like the spools. The spools I use are these kind of spools, and that's the 12 weight. And you get quite a bit of thread on there. And one of my arguments about thread is I don't want thousands of yards. I just want enough to play with it and not get bored with that color. So these smaller ones do appeal to me more. So yes, going over seams. Yeah, going over seams. I haven't got a seam here to go over, but clearly it's not going to be as easy as not going over a seam. But this is my advice to you. If you have to go over a seam, I would use some Elmer's glue or something like that, and I would glue the seams down either side. Now, if it's a double serger seam, it's going to be quite thick and it's going to make it, it's not going to look as good as it could. Okay. But if I was doing something where I could open up the seam, I would glue down either side of the seam allowance to the main fabric and just carry on. And I think you'd find it wouldn't be, it, it shouldn't give you too much problem, but it's double thickness. You're going to see a difference. So that is a thought. Certainly not so much with the heavier thread as with the lighter threads. So, do I have any more questions? Yes, you can change the size of the rolled hem width. You can make it wider. I often sew down a fold and make a what's called imitation piping. And that's very attractive, but it's better when you increase the size of the hem. It's worth experimenting. You know, it's worth taking time to have a play and see what works best for you. Uh, my stitch width was 4, I think, and I think it's generally recommended to be 3.5. Mine was so between 3 and 3.5, but I have gone wider. Okay, so do I have any more questions? Right. Well, this week I am off to Chicago. I'm going to a creative sewing studio in Geneva, Illinois. The next week I'm in Austin, Texas at So Much More. I have a number of online classes that I want to get set up and running, but I haven't got them ready to go quite yet. But I've got a good idea of what you want. Um, Next year, I've kind of tried to make it so that I'll do one online class every month at least, so that I stay in touch with that because I know a lot of you just can't travel to events. So Beryl says, come to Australia. Wow, that's a long way for me to fly these days. But I would love to, but I don't know that I will. But anyway, come in and do the online classes if you live in Australia because you can still have fun with those. Right. I wish you all well. I thank you all for coming in. I really plan to do a bit more designing too in the new year. I've got lots of stuff on the go. My head's full of it. I just haven't been home long enough at any time to deal with it. But I will see you now. I will be back next Monday, and I look forward to seeing you then. And I hope you have a great week and post up anything that you do on your Serger. I will put the notes up for this in the group right now. Okay, see you soon. Good night.